Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Madeline McDonough. I'm the State E-rate Coordinator for Libraries for the New York State Library. We're very pleased that so many people could join us on a Friday afternoon to learn more about the Emergency Connectivity Fund. Today's webinar is going to be brought to you with the expertise of Wynn Hemsworth. Wynn is the Executive Director of E-Rate Central, a Long Island-based E-rate consulting firm that's been working with the New York State Library and the New York State Education Department for over 20 years. He's also the State E-rate Coordinator for New York Schools and is actively involved in SECA, the State E-rate Coordinators Alliance, and in Shelby, the Schools Health and Libraries Broadband Coalition. E-Rate Central provides E-rate support nationally to 8 state education and/or library departments with over 900 individual schools and library E-rate applicants. Wynn is married with 3 grown children, one of whom has started E-Rate Central with him. Today he's going to be talking about the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which is part of the American Rescue Plan Act. A $7 billion fund is set aside to help bridge the homework gap and for the purchase of COVID-19 emergency eligible equipment and advanced telecommunication and information services. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be posted to the New York State Library website once closed captioning has been completed, and Wynn will provide a link to these slides that will also be available from the New York State Library website with a link to E-Rate Central. While E-Rate and ECF are different programs, they're both going to be under the auspices of USAC, the United Services Administrative Company, is going to be doing oversight for it. And Wynn, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. It's a pleasure. So we're going to talk about this Emergency Connectivity Fund, ECF. Let me start with a disclaimer. It's a brand new program. The FCC put it together basically in 4 months. And as a result, there are a ton of questions that have not been answered. In fact, just earlier today, Shelby, the Schools Health and Libraries Broadband Coalition, sent a letter to the FCC with a whole series of questions. That was an 8-page letter. So we're going to be able to talk about the basic program, who's eligible, locations, users. We're going to talk about the filing window, which could open as early as later this month, at least the first window. Although this program does rely on a lot of the E-rate functions, there are some major differences. So we'll talk about how they're going to do invoicing. We're going to talk about Children's Internet Protection Act. There are a whole number of additional certifications on the applications that we need to pay attention to. There are record retention requirements that are a lot more difficult because we're going to be talking about services and equipment out among your patrons rather than in-house. And we'll talk a little bit about what you should be doing right now until we actually get notice from the FCC when the application window is going to be open. So Natalie mentioned this is a $7.1 billion fund that's been set up under the American Recovery Act. In actual funding, it's about $7 billion. There's 1+% that's been set aside for the administration of this program and significantly for audits after the funding is over. So this is a separate E-rate fund designed to support remote learning during the pandemic. It's going to be administered by USAC, which administers the E-rate program and is going to use some of the same E-rate systems. One big difference is this is not going to be funded out of the Universal Service Fund. It's going to come directly out of the Treasury, which is good news because the funding under the Universal Service Fund is based on contributions of interstate revenues and that's up to 33+% now. So this isn't going to make that problem any worse. And what it does is it pays for equipment and internet for unserved patrons, whether they be students or not. This obviously also covers the schools where the focus is entirely students. There's a first application window this summer, which will cover expenditures for equipment and services for the 2021-2022 year. There's a second window. There actually may be multiple windows until they run out of money that could cover retroactive payments back to March of 2020. So expenditures of the nature that are covered by this program that were made after the pandemic really started in March of 2020 would be covered in a second window or possibly a third window. You'll see that there are some serious certification and record retention requirements. And as I mentioned, there are a ton of unanswered questions when we get into the details. So, because this is basically an E-rate program, the eligible entities are the same. If a school or a library was eligible for E-rate, it is also eligible for ECF funding. There's a minor expansion in the definition for tribal libraries, but essentially it's the same base. Whether or not a school or a library has applied for E-rate in the past, as long as they're an E-rate eligible entity, they're eligible for ECF. The big difference between ECF and our traditional E-rate is this is designed to support off-campus uses. So it's not even homes. It could be community centers or homeless shelters or things like that. It does not include equipment or services that would be covered by traditional E-rate on campus. It's interesting for New York libraries is it does cover wireless in bookmobiles, but that's always been eligible under standard E-rate. So from a bookmobile standpoint, we think there is funding available both for traditional E-rate and ECF. Eligible users, it applies to library patrons who do not have sufficient internet access or connected devices. And one difference between schools and libraries in this program is to the extent that a library puts out equipment or provides at-home services, for example, it does require a certification signed by the patrons that they didn't have access to these services or equipment before. So what's eligible? Basically two things. Connecting devices, laptops and tablets. They've said desktop computers are not eligible because they're not deemed to be mobile. Smartphones, a number of people wanted smartphones to be eligible. They are not. Wi-Fi hotspots, which I know some of the libraries have already provided to some patrons, or cellular air cards are eligible. Modems, routers, or the equivalent are eligible. The eligible service is predominantly commercially available internet services, including installation and basic and other fees. We had hoped initially that this program would allow libraries, many of whom have boosted up their antennas on their building to provide internet services in their parking lots, for example, to extend that out into the community. The program as designed will cover some of that, but with a very strict requirement that it will only cover it if you can certify and document that there is no commercially available service in the area. And that means you've got to go talk to the internet service providers in the area and say, we're trying to get service to this area. and they have to say, no, we don't provide service there. There are some price caps on the service and equipment. Laptops and tablets are capped at $400 a piece. If you need to get a device that costs more than that, for example, for someone with disability, the waivers are available, but you've got to ask for them. Wi-Fi hotspots, the price is capped at $250. For modems and routers, there is no cap at the moment, but what the FCC has done is ask USAC to come up with some guidelines on that. Interestingly enough, they think that if a school or a library provides broadband internet for its students or patrons on a bulk basis, they can get it at $10 to $25 per month per user. I think that may be a touch aggressive, but we'll see. The other limitation is it must be used primarily for educational purposes. So patrons that want to play games and want a device just to do that, this doesn't apply to that. And in the certifications that the patrons are going to have to sign, they're going to have to say, not only don't we have access to a device or a service, but we need this for some form of educational purpose, which is really not defined that well yet. Devices are can be put out for single individual users, meaning that a family might have 2 or 3 users and can get 2 or 3 devices loaned to them. We had hoped that a number of other things might become eligible under this program, like backup equipment or cybersecurity tools in particular, or technical support. FCC does not provide that under this ECF program. So it's really just the devices and the service. So how are they going to do this? They're going to open a 45-day application window. The goal is to have that open as soon as possible. The FCC is talking about that being as early as the end of this month. But what USAC's going to have to do, because they plan to use the same basic 471 application process, they're going to have to make some major changes in that. There are changes on certifications. It's the current 471 is set up for either a category 1 or category 2, and that is not a function that plays into ECF. So the first window is going to fund purchases of equipment and services for the period July 1, 2021 through June 30th of 2022. So basically the next fiscal year. The trick is to make this available as easy and as quickly as possible. So one of the things they've done is said there are no FCC competitive bidding requirements. So we don't have, unlike traditional E-rate, a Form 470 that we have to go through. We don't have that 28-day minimum waiting requirements before the 470 became active. But they do require that any state and local bidding requirements apply. And there is a certification that says, I have complied with any state and local requirements. Assuming that this first window for the 21-22 period does not chew up all of $7 billion, and I don't think it will, then they're going to have additional windows. If as they go through the first window, they find everyone saying, or not everyone, but a significant number of potential applicants saying, we really need to file an application here. We couldn't get it done in the first window. So they may open up a second window for that 2021-22 period. But the presumption is once you get past this first year, that they will open a window for retroactive purchases from the start of the pandemic. So from March 1, 2020 through the end of this month would be covered in the second window, which tells you over the next couple of weeks that if there's things you need to buy that is funded by ECF, you can arrange for that, but don't take delivery of them until after July 1. Otherwise, you're going to get pushed into a second window with perhaps less funding knowledge of what's going to be available. But at some point, as they go through first, second, third, or even fourth or fifth window, presumably they're going to run out of money. The $7 billion is going to be used up. So they have a scheme to prioritize who gets funding in that situation. And this gets a touch complicated, but for those of you who remember the old days of Priority 2 funding in E-rate, they're using a similar mechanism. They're going to start by funding the most needy schools and libraries, and they're going to use a modified discount rate to do that. So you have to be careful of that, because once you get funded, reimbursement is at 100% level. So the discount rate is important only if they run out of money within a window and have to prioritize it. And they've changed the discount rate matrix a little bit to give an additional 5% discount, and I put that in air quotes, to schools and libraries located in rural areas. So if you look at this discount matrix that they've got, what it's saying is, if in a window we don't have enough money, we will first fund rural applicants at the 95% level, then we'll fund urban at the 90, then rural at the 85, urban at the 80. So what they've done is they've given a little half-step benefit to the rurals. So that's discount matrix is used only for prioritization purposes. Once you're funded and funding is approved, it's reimbursement at 100% level, regardless of where you fit in this prioritization scheme. So they're hoping to get those applications processed pretty quickly. They've said we'll start paying invoices after 15 days after the first funding wave goes out. We expect that applications will be approved much like traditional E-rate, perhaps every week of funding wave. The initial plan for this program was they were going to do it only on a reimbursement basis, equivalent to the BEARS forms that we've been using, or some of us have been using for E-rate for a long time. What they got was a bunch of comments that said that's wonderful, but particularly for the poorer schools and libraries, we can't afford to front end 100% of the purchases and then wait for reimbursement. So they did two things. First, they said, okay, service providers can invoice for it, much like they've done in E-rate on the SPIES. The one difference being that it's not the applicant's choice. If the applicant wants the service provider to discount, the service provider has to agree to do that. And it looks like the Form 471 will require, on a funding request by funding request basis, you to indicate who's going to do the invoicing, and that you've got concurrence from the service provider if you want service provider. Otherwise, it's on a reimbursement basis. Except that they allow you to get reimbursement on a prepaid basis, meaning if you have a contract and an invoice, from a service provider for something that's been approved, you can go and file the equivalent of a bear form now without having paid the service provider, as long as you do pay that service provider within 30 days, which is clearly going to have to be documented. So invoicing works a little differently. The deadlines are differently. Traditionally, E-rate deadlines on invoicing was 120 days after the service went in or the last day to receive services. That's now 60 days after you get a funding commitment, after the period of time is over, or after what's called the service delivery date. So we think for most part during this first window where the services, particularly recurring services, are for the period going through June 30th of 2022, the real invoice deadline is going to be 60 days after that, which is going to be August 29th of 2022. There's also a requirement that everyone has a SAM number. They're registered in the Systems and Award Management Registration System, which is a government thing that's required of anyone getting money out of the Treasury. I've seen some libraries and some schools that for other purposes already have SAM registrations, but if you go to sam.gov, you can look up your entity and see if it's already registered. And when you're looking it up, you also need to check the expiration date, because this is a registration that requires annual renewals. So you want to have the expiration date within the period that you're going to get invoices paid. The FCC has historically avoided the question of Children's Internet Protection Act for devices that are used outside of a library or outside of a school. But this is clearly a program that's designed for off-campus. So they have come up with SIPA rules for this. And basically what they're saying is, one, any computer or device, so laptop or tablet, that's owned by the library, if the library is receiving either ECF funding or E-rate funding for internet or internal connections, then that device needs to be filtered, and the library has to be SIPA compliant, meaning it's got a publicly approved internet safety policy. This does not apply to third-party owned devices, so you could provide service to someone that has a computer in the house that they own themselves. That computer, you don't have to worry about its filtering. There's an interesting thing in the rules that says SIPA certification is not required for applicants who have already certified compliance in the given funding year. So that implies if you've already been funded for 2021 for regular E-rate, you filed a Form 486, you won't have to provide an additional SIPA certification. At least that's what it implies from what we've seen at OMB of the draft of the 471 application for ECF. It's got these certifications built in. So maybe there's a check mark that says it doesn't apply because I've already certified it. But you ought to be prepared to certify in any event. So while we're talking about certifications, we ought to note that there's a lot more certifications that are going to be in this Form 471 application. The traditional E-rate application had, I haven't counted lately, 6 or 7 certifications. I've seen at least a dozen more that are being planned for ECF. The most important one is that funding is to meet otherwise unmet connectivity needs. libraries have a little bit of an advantage in making that certification because, as I indicated earlier, any patron who takes advantage of this program through a library is going to have to sign a certification to you that says we need this service because we didn't have access any other way. So that's going to be a little bit easier. You're going to have to certify that your compliance with state and local procurements. You're going to have to certify that there's no duplicate funding. Duplicate in the ECF arena means these were needs that were not filled and already funded by any other pandemic relief funds. There's a certification on educational purpose. Again, I think the libraries can solve that through their patron certification. There are certifications that say all this equipment is eligible under ECF. There is a 10-year record retention, just like there is for any E-rate thing, which really means from the start when you apply to after the equipment is provided in another 10 years, you're typically talking 11 or 12 years of record retention. There's a specific certification that says, I acknowledge that I will participate in any post-commitment review or audits. And one of the things to note here is that the ECF program from a funding standpoint is designed to run from the start of the pandemic, which was March 1 of 2020, through one fiscal year after the Department of Health determines that the pandemic is over. So if you assume that we're going to get that notice, and I hope we do, sometime in the 21-22 period, then that means they can fund things, assuming there's money, through additional windows up until June 30th of 2023. But if you read the legislation, it says the legislation is good through September 30th of 2030. And the reason for that, I believe, is that this extra money that's been set aside for administrative purposes and for audits is going to cover any audits that go out, to 2030. So good reason for keeping all the records then. So record retention from a timing standpoint is the same as what we've gotten used to E-rate, but the type of records is much more detailed. For services or equipment, they want to know the type of service, whether it's fixed or wireless. They want to know if it's monthly internet service, what's the speed? If it's wireless, is there a data cap? If it's equipment that goes out, they want to know what the equipment is, when it was loaned out, when it came back. If it came back, they want to know the individual that it went to. So that's a lot of record keeping. You're going to have to support all those certifications, so that's out there. So again, the program as a whole provides funding through June of 2023. At the moment, we're only talking a window that goes through June of 2022, but there could be, if there's money, a program that'll go out another window, that'll go out another year. But this administrative funding goes out to September 30th of 2030. So a few other things to think about and what makes this program a little bit different. In traditional E-rate during the pandemic, the FCC waived its gift rules. That waiver in general expires at the end. It had been extended for 1 year. expires June 30th of this year. To the extent you are gifted services or equipment related to this type of program, in other words, remote learning or educational use of a patron at home, that waiver now goes out through June 30th of 2022. They've changed the appeal and waiver window. One of the reasons they're doing this is they're trying to get people who are funded to get and use that money as quickly as possible so that they know how much money they've left over that can be applied to a second or a third window. So you saw that in the invoicing requirement, which is 60 days rather than 120 days, but it also applies to appeals to USAC or appeals to the FCC or waiver requests to the FCC, which historically for E-rate has been 60 days. It is now 30 days. There have been questions about if we buy devices, how long should you expect them to last? There's a presumption that the life cycle of laptops and tablets is 3 years. The Form 471 is going to ask a series of questions about how you determined how much the service and equipment you're asking for. And I know some libraries have already started to do that, maybe started it even before the pandemic thing hit. But there's going to be some questions on the 471. They would encourage you to do a narrative of the type of study you did and your results. And they are building a function into the 471 that will allow you to update or upload that narrative. Consortium applications. I see this more at the school level, but I know there's a few library consortia out there where the consortium lead has essentially handled all the E-rate functions for its members. I will point out that that becomes a little bit more difficult under ECF. I had a discussion with a school consortium yesterday, and they said the record retention requirements, the certifications on needs are something that we're just not comfortable in making on behalf of our members and keeping track of those. So to the extent that a library consortium is acting on behalf of its members, it needs to understand that there's going to require to be a lot more coordination between the members and the consortium lead on this thing. The other factor that comes into play with a consortium is how does this all work if we have a window that requires prioritization? Because in that case, we're back to using that discount matrix I showed you earlier, and a typical consortium has a discount rate that is the average of its members. And if you do that and say you have a consortium that has an average discount of 77%, then that application would not be funded until after the rural 80, 95 and 85 or the urban 90 or 80. So you may be in a situation where the consortium doesn't get funded, but the individual members, if they'd applied on their own, would have been. The only way to solve that from a consortium standpoint, we know, is to do multiple consortium applications, say one for the 95% rurals, one for the 80% urbans, et cetera, and work down from that. And even within that, if they run out of money, they will then go to the actual NSLP eligibility percentages. So we're struggling with a lot of questions that are still to be answered, as I pointed out. Shelby just submitted an 8-page list of questions to the FCC. The state E-rate coordinators submitted roughly the same number of questions a couple of weeks ago. We expect that we're going to see, hopefully within the next couple of weeks, at least the first of some frequently asked questions or additional guidance coming out of either the FCC or USAC. So the question for libraries, or actually for any applicants looking at ECF, is what do we do next? The first thing I would do is I just go read the order, which is FCC 21-58. I'll show you a link to that in a second. It's rather lengthy. You have to read not only the text, but all the footnotes, or at least most of the footnotes. If you haven't done it already, you need to start thinking about which of my patrons are going to be eligible for this and what's the demand going to be for it. And I know some libraries have started that. Because it does work off of, when we get into prioritization over discount rates, we're encouraging everyone, particularly the schools, to go out there and get their NSLP data out there. The libraries aren't really in control of that, but if the school district in which they are located doesn't have its EPC data up to date, is going to create a problem as we go forward. So you need to encourage them to do that. I mentioned the SAM registration. You need to apply for that or renew it or update it, and you're going to have to keep that up to date. If you're going to provide devices, those laptops and tablets, we're already hearing that a lot of these, there are supply problems. So now is the time, if you haven't already done it, to start talking to suppliers about what's available, what are the costs, what's the availability from a timing and shipping standpoint. And we're waiting for a lot more data. The way to keep up to date with that is USAC puts out a news brief every Friday afternoon. And if you go to the USAC site, which I'll show you, most of you know, but I'll show you in a minute, you can subscribe to the news brief. E-Rate Central puts out a newsletter. Natalie puts out lots of information. So you're already getting all that kind of stuff. So a couple of links, and we will make these slides all available to Natalie to post. But this is the report in order. Actually, this should be 58. I'm going to change that. The general E-Rate site is usac.org/E-Rate. E-Rate Central is eratecentral.com. So with that, well, let me keep the screen up. I normally take the screen down, but depending on what the questions are, we may want to go back to a slide. So Natalie, you want to moderate into discussion?
I have. The first question we got asked, which I was able to answer, was about applying for E-Rate directly. So there was a link put in initially the Q&A, and I realized we've moved from Q&A to chat for the timing when E-Rate can be funded, and that's also through the USAC site. The first question we had up was that it was mentioned that hotspots are limited to $250. Is that spread out over the eligible window? The devices we use don't cost money for the device, just the monthly subscription charge.
Good question. So if we think that the monthly subscription, which includes the internet and the hotspot, will be covered by this program. If you have a choice, however, I would try to pay for the hotspot up front and then pay less for internet going forward. Because if we run out of money and we never go beyond this first year, the 2021-22, then going forward from that, you're going to be doing that without ECF funding. So to the extent you can get ECF to pay up front for the hotspot and then thereby lower the ongoing monthly cost, you'll be better post ECF.
Okay. A similar type question on that theme is, in the case of a Wi-Fi device that are free but billed at, say, $39.99 a month, would the $250 just cover the first few months of that and then nothing after that?
And this is without service? The $39.95 doesn't include the service, it's just the hotspot.
I believe the $39.99 is the service, but if that was Roger's question, but if he wants to go into the chat and clarify that if I've misspoken.
Yeah.
I think that's the monthly charge because it says billed monthly, but the device was free.
Yeah, if it includes the internet service, then my first answer stands. If it's just, if you will, a least cost for the hotspot, and then you've got to also get internet service. Rules don't actually specify that. I would assume it would be $39.99 until you hit $250.
Okay. Okay. The next question was relating to consortium or library systems, public library systems. One of the systems notes that they file on behalf of all of their members for E-rate. Will individual members of a system also be eligible, or like E-rate, will the system only be allowed to file on their behalf?
Okay. So let's be careful about terminology, particularly in New York State, of what a library system is. In many cases, a library system is one that's providing services to independent member libraries. But in some cases, a library system is one that is just providing services to its branches. So we've got a lot of library systems upstate that have done E-rate on a consortium basis, whereas we have something like the Brooklyn Library System, which is not a consortium, but is the equivalent of a school district. Okay.
In this case, it's Monroe County, so there are branches of the Rochester Public Library and there are member libraries.
Right. So it's got members who are libraries in themselves with their own one or more branches, correct? In that case, we're back to the situation I mentioned at the end of, does the library system acting as a consortium want to file for its members? If they do that, they are making the certifications on behalf of their members. They are responsible for tracking the equipment and inventories and whose that equipment is being used by. And they have to think about whether they file one consortium application that would essentially rely on an average discount rate for prioritization purposes, or do they cover themselves and file separate applications for different groups of member libraries based on their individual discount rates?
Okay. The follow-up to that is, if the system is applying, does that prevent the libraries from applying as it does with E-rate?
I don't think it precludes them to doing it. Obviously, they can't apply for the same thing.
Okay. All right. Okay, and I think the questions have moved to the chat. So the next one was How would a library filter a laptop or tablet that is taken home by a patron and used with their own personal internet?
Okay. So in that sense, the libraries have, I think, a more difficult problem. In the school case, you can make these devices go back through the library system's internet. But I don't suspect that's the case in most libraries. So there are ways to configure at least some degree of filtering within an individual laptop or tablet, and you'd have to set it up that way. Remember that the filtering requirement really doesn't say how effective the filter is. It just says you have to have some technical device that controls content to some degree. In one sense, if it blocked one website, it fulfills that function. That's obviously not the spirit of SIPA, but you'd have to configure those laptops to have some degree of filtering on them, which a smart person could get around.
Okay. The next question is, if the hotspot is included in the monthly service that isn't owned by the library, would SIPA requirements still be, would there still be the SIPA requirement?
So the hotspot is not the problem. It's the laptop or computer.
Okay. Rex, I don't know if that answered your question, but please let us know if it did not. The next question is, will items acquired through the program need to be deacquisitioned after the 1-year window post-pandemic?
No.
And the next question was, does anyone have a good resource for SIPA compliance filtering configurations for Google Chrome management, for example? So that's a general question to everyone.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. I encourage everyone to go into the chat to ask their questions. We'll wait a few minutes for a few more come up. If there's any that I've missed, please do ask them again in the chat function. Thank you. If anyone has questions after the webinar is over, please feel free to reach out to me at State Library, natalie.mcdonough@nysed.gov. And if I don't have the answer, I will check with Wynn to see what information I can get for you.
And if I don't have the answer, we'll sit and wait for USAC and the FCC, maybe.
Yes, there's a lot of information through the report and order, but it is 83 pages long. It's incredibly detailed, but a lot to take in. Okay, I'm going to give my last call for questions from everyone. Okay, the next question was, are laptops for library staff eligible, like for school staff?
And the answer is no. The reason for that, by the way, is, and it's still a bit of a question even for school staff, is the presumption is that in a remote learning situation, a teacher without access is useless if they're working from home. And one of the outstanding questions for schools is, are all staff eligible or just teaching related staff? It appears that it's teaching related staff. So the assumption was that library patrons, even if library staff was working at home, they didn't need access, or the library staff didn't need access to them, or vice versa. To the extent a library staff person does not have their own device and their own internet access and could be considered a patron as well as a staff member of that library, they're welcome to get a device and service.
Okay. We have a couple of more questions have come in. For Wi-Fi hotspots, does the ECF funding only cover the year of service 2021-2022? If devices are expected to be in service 3 years, does that mean we will be required to continue service for up to 3 years, or can we request for 3 years of service?
If it's a purchase of a hotspot, it's covered in the year that it's purchased, which means at the moment, the first window of next coming July through the following June. If this ECF goes away and the hotspot's still there and someone, whether it's a homeowner or the school or library, continues to pay for the service, that's fine, but there's no ECF on that. At some point, they could have a window that would cover the 22 to 23 period, but so far they're not talking about that. But funding, as far as the program is concerned, goes out through June of 2023.
Okay. Next question is, can you talk a bit more about the record keeping portion in regards to keeping records of the name of the service, the name the service was provided to, and how does this work with patron confidentiality for public libraries? I think we have others on the call who've been involved with that question in the past.
Yeah, that's a Ken Stone question. So this has been a big issue. From two standpoints. One is, I know a lot of libraries automatically purge their loan data as soon as books come back or within a month or two, right? Can't do that under this program. In terms of confidentiality, there is an indication in the rules that the FCC understands that this is confidential and will only ask for data almost under a subpoena-like process. I don't know whether individual libraries or the state are going to be comfortable with that, but that's what we're dealing with.
Okay. We just got a question came in just under the wire. When the funding runs out, or if we are able to allocate funds in next year's fiscal budget for internet service, will we still be required to maintain certifications?
So next year in that question refers to 22, 23?
It doesn't say, but let's answer that question to start then.
So in
22, 23 is clarified by the questioner.
Okay. So at that point in time, if there's no ECF funding for 22, 23, then from a record keeping standpoint, you probably don't have to pay attention to monthly recurring services. But if you provided the devices, then whenever they do an audit for, even if it's 21, 22, you need to be able to say where that device is. So I believe the record keeping requirement for devices at least extends into years that are not directly covered by ECF until that device gets returned. Okay.
Does anyone have any last questions before we wrap up for today?
Yeah.
Added my email to the chat if anybody needs that.
What you didn't see is down below where my picture shows, A couple of those questions I've answered with my fingers crossed because we still want to see we still want to see some confirmation on a lot of these things.
There's more information. There's been a lot of, there are webinars upcoming also on ECF as we get more information, and a lot of entities are involved. As Wynn mentioned, Shelby's involved with it. ALA has been very heavily involved as well. The state E-rate coordinators, SICA, even though it's not E-rate, it's covering a lot of the same territory.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to figure out for both schools and libraries, what is the spirit of this funding and how do you best meet that? Because I'm seeing some schools who have one-to-ones saying, "Oh, this is great. I'm going to refresh all of my my Chromebooks," and the program really wasn't set up to do that. So where we're starting to come down is to go to schools and libraries and say, okay, the first window is for 21-22. But what did you do during the real height of the pandemic from March 1 of 2020 through this June? Well, I bought so many devices and I lent them out and I provided services to these people and things like that. And I do have a record of that, sort of. And now in my first window, I'm going to say, okay, there's additional money. What else do I need to do for this coming year? Am I still getting demand from patrons for more devices? Okay, I loaned out 100, maybe 50 more will do me. Okay, and if so, they'll need the service. And of the 100 I've already loaned out and I provided service to those people, or maybe they are paying for their own, but if I provided service, I'm probably going to continue that over the 21-22 year, as opposed to saying, well, any patron who doesn't have a computer, I can now go buy one for them and loan it out on a semi-permanent basis. I don't think the program was set up to do that, the intent of that. The real focus was, let's get people through the pandemic. And yeah, it would be nice to have these services going forward to solve the homework gap for schools or equivalent educational needs of patrons. And in some cases, the schools, the libraries were handling it for the schools anyway. So that's the real focus of the program, in my opinion.
Okay. All right, we haven't got any more questions. I'd like to thank Wynn for providing us with all of this great information today. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time on a Friday afternoon to spend with us. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Bye.